So Linda Colley, we have cited again and again, Linda Colley has redefined British history. When we were teenagers in India, we read that Indians, or we were told that the British thought that we couldn't be a nation. Indians couldn't be a nation. Indians were castes and Indians were religious communities, but not a nation. Whereas Britain was a natural nation. The term again and again, Britain was a natural nation or the first nation of the world. Right? Linda Colley's account suggests that British identity was constructed. How was it constructed? Is the subject of a 600-page masterpiece, which not only historians of Britain read, but now all of us read. So the starting point is the 1707 Act of Union, which brings together the Welsh and the Scots and the English into a union called Britain. Right? However, British sentiments were not shared. It was a policy intervention and it was a piece of law. But there was no Britishness. There were three different groups coming together legally, but there was no Britishness shared. How was Britishness created? Britishness was created between 1707 Act and 1830. Her account ends with 1837, the rise of Victorian age. Right? In this 1707-1837 period, and she gives you enough data. This is not systematic, the kind of data that we have today, but enough extraction of examples to persuade you that she's right. And the threefold argument is based on shared Protestantism, war with Catholic France, and something that nationalists in India always argued, that India was economically useful. In her argument, it was economically useful, but for bringing the Scottish and English union. Right? In that sense. So, how does it work? What is shared Protestantism here? Union 1707, but internal differences. England, well, you only 10 miles. This is another example, right? If your best mode of transport gives you 10 miles an hour, it is unlikely to lead to national consciousness. We need a different kind of technology to get people from Madras and Delhi and Kolkata and Bombay to begin to feel that they belong to one political unit. They might belong to Indian civilization, all of them, but one political unit called India. Right? Therefore, remember the argument that was popular in certain scholarly circles, that without the rail system in India, not only newspapers, without the rail system in India, which the British did not introduce to create Indian nation, which they introduced to rationalize British administration of this vast continent. We wanted to connect Mumbai, Bombay, then Bombay, Madras, Calcutta and Delhi quickly. Right? In the process, Gandhi also took the train and would go from Bombay at the same speed at which British administrators would go. Right? Look at how the argument goes, right? Okay. So English, 10 miles an hour, 4 times as large as the other two. Welsh until 1880 did not speak English. They spoke Welsh. Scots, same London Parliament, but distinct social, legal and educational structure, plus separate religious organizations. There was never a Church of Britain. Church of England, yes. Church of Scotland, there was never a Church of Britain. Even today, their soccer teams are different, etc., etc. And anti-Catholicism until 1829, the Catholics had no vote, exclusion from all state offices, parliament, punitive taxes, they couldn't carry no weapons, Catholic riots are all there. Only one part of Britain was Catholic, that was Highland Scotland. Only one part, and that creates serious issues in British history. because that's connected to the princely families. Highlanders invade England right till 1745 and came 140 miles north of London, which essentially means something around Midlands or so, right? Not Yorkshire, but below Yorkshire, something around Midlands or so. It's not a big country, so 140 miles. I'm not sure why this is made so vigorously in her book, because it's not really, it's a very small place. 140 miles north of Delhi or north of it would be a big claim. 140 miles north of London, occupying armies coming, is not a very big claim. But anyway, she makes a claim. But the point is to say that anti-Catholicism and shared Protestantism begin to stitch the three communities together, and the Highlanders you have to deal with. That's all. But the other factor was wars with Catholic France. Look at the number of wars: 1689 to 1697, 1702 to 1713, 1743 to 1748. The last war, the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. So there is an other, that is France, just across the channel. It's an enemy country. It's also Catholic. So shared Protestantism on the one hand and having a Catholic enemy just across the channel these two begin to stitch these three communities together. And finally, the peripheries. In the title of that chapter, famous chapter is Peripheries, the most important issues are Scots and the English Empire. Scots were never more than 10% of Britain. Scots in British India were 40 to 50% of the army, 40 to 50% of the so-called writers. There's a writers' building in Calcutta, right? They were writers for the British Empire, which was headquartered in Calcutta till 1911. He did? Niall Ferguson has written about this? I haven't seen his account. I've seen, yeah. So you've seen that account, right? So the idea is that the book explains that there are two reasons why Scots made British Empire, especially British Indian Empire, their home. One was, of course, opportunities that were not available in England because Scots were considered inferior people. Even the brightest like Macaulay felt uncomfortable in England, but in India they could write the education minute, come for 2.5 years, make a lot of money. There's very good biographical material on this. Macaulay came from a poor family. He was very bright. His uncle gave him a loan to be in Cambridge, where he topped. Toppers of Oxford and Cambridge were often recruited by the Empire, by East India Company. And the Scots especially were attracted to that because the Empire, apart from providing all these opportunities, right? It's another famous section of the book. The Empire was the only place where the Scots and English could be equal. It was not called English Empire. It was always called British Empire. And she says, in a lovely passage, she says, even today, if you go to London and you ask, where are you going? You say you're going to England. But when you came to Britain's Indian Empire, you did not say you were going to the English Empire. It was always called British Empire. The nomenclature itself made Scots feel much more at home. The Welsh apparently went to the West Indian colonies. I don't have, that's what I've heard when I presented this, when Linda Colley presented this argument in a seminar. She has not studied this herself. But Scots, 10% of Britain were always 30, 40, 50% of India. 30% of British in India. And so this is an argument, it is in this form that new history is saying that Indian Empire contributed to Britain. not in the form in which nationalists made the argument that it funded, for example, the Industrial Revolution. The Indian Empire funded the Industrial Revolution. There is economic impoverishment of India. New histories are telling you that as well. Because 1750s India, when the British conquest begins, 1750s India, according to economic historians writing today, China had 32% of the world's manufacturing output at that time. That's the estimate. And India had 25% of the manufacturing output. So these were not places which had no manufacturing and no economic development to which the British came. So there is some truth to the argument that the nationalists made. However, it would be hard to prove that extraction from India funded the entire Industrial Revolution. That's a separate point. There's some extraction, but the extraction funding the entire Industrial Revolution is a separate point. Exists which might lead to the breakup of Britain. Tom Nairn, a famous Marxist historian, also wrote about it, but Linda Colley is writing in a different way and is predicting Scotland's departure from Britain. We have a vote coming up on September 19th. We'll see. Even if they're wrong, even if 40% of Scotland, 35% of Scotland votes in favor of separation, that will suggest something. Right? Finally, I don't have a slide on it, but what is the fundamental claim of Eugene Weber about France? Peasants into Frenchmen. At that time, we did not use the term constructivist when this book emerged, 1976. But what was the argument? The argument was that at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the evidence suggests that not more than 15 to 20% of France spoke French. Indeed, as late as 60 to 70 years after the French Revolution, the Basque country of France and Brittany, these two places, there was no knowledge, even as late as that, very little knowledge of French. They spoke something that was not French. So the claim that Weber made is that only by 1818, 1890 or 1900 do you finally have a French nation in place where everybody speaks French. How was this achieved? He argues there were two reasons, two ways in which peasants were turned into Frenchmen. One was the public school system. France is famous for its public schools. They're government schools, not Indian public schools which follow the English model, where these public schools were private, but they prepared you for public life. That's why they were called public schools. Right? Public schools of France were government schools, not private schools, and they spread from Paris to the periphery. And taught, the medium of instruction was French. And now, some historians writing considerable violence was used to impose French. Secondly, peasants were conscripted. France kept fighting a lot of wars. And conscription, peasants were conscripted in the army, and we know that conscription into the army has historically been an agent of nation building. We know that. Right? So this is another, so the two of the oldest nations in the literature, France and Britain, these histories suggest, which are now widely accepted, they were constructed. Nations don't exist, nations were constructed in modern times.